Hello class, welcome to your lecture on three fascinating post-Milesian thinkers, Xenophanes, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras. Aristotle credits Xenophanes, who flourished around 540 BC, that he was the first who looked upon the sky and had a theory of everything, thus giving him some pride of place among the pre-Socratics. Xenophanes was born in Colophon, an Ionian Greek city of Asia Minor, but he immigrated to the west, to Sicily or southern Italy. Thus, although an Ionian thinker, he was instrumental in the founding of Eleatic philosophy and had a major influence on Pythagoras, who also moved to Italy. Xenophanes seems to have lived a terribly long life. In his own words, already there are 7 and 60 years, tossing my thought up and down the land of Greece, and from my birth there were another 25 to add to these. So he would have been 101 when he said this. He introduced a new kind of philosophical poetry, which could be regarded as a response to the philosophical prose of the Milesians. In particular, he wrote didactic poems in epic meter, elegiacs, and iambics, and he also wrote satirical poems. He criticized Homer and Hesiod for the immorality of their myths, a major theme we'll see taken up again in Heraclitus and especially in Plato's Republic. From the little that survives of his work, we find inquiries into ethics, divinity, and the physical structure of the cosmos. He considered earth, Gaia, and water, Hudor, to be the basic material principles or stuff of all being. Recall Anaximenes had attempted to reconcile Thales and Anaximander by saying that the prime element was air. So Thales was right about there being a prime element, and Anaximander was right about it being closer in nature to the unlimited. And for Xenophanes, all things are composed of earth and water. In a way, Xenophanes brings Ionian physicalism back to earth. For all things are from earth, and into earth all things come to their end. Like other Ionians, he elucidated natural phenomena in terms of material rather than divine causalities, giving us the first truly biospheric theory of the circulation of water. He challenged Anaximander's idea of a drum-shaped earth where life can be found on both surfaces, so there is no antediluvian inverted world on the other side of what's beneath us so long as we drill far enough. Instead, we live on top of an earth which stretches down indefinitely beneath our feet. Earth does, however, have a visible border in the horizon. The sun is a collection of little fiery particle clouds gathered from moist exhalations during the day, while the stars are rekindled from the separation of the fiery particle clouds at night. The sun goes infinitely onwards, even though it appears to have a circular motion. Xenophanes also observed the geological significance of fossils, and may have been the first to propose, from studying them at high altitudes, that the earth was long ago covered in mud or water. He also posited periodic floods that destroyed the human race. In an anecdote in Diogenes, he seems to not be a proponent of the Pythagorean theory of the transmigration of the soul, which seems to have been entering into Greece around this time. Xenophanes is most remembered for his critique of anthropomorphism, that is, the tendency to imagine the divine and all things on the model of the human being or cosmic man in human form. His most quoted lines of all are these, in which he underlines the cultural relativism of our various projection into images of the divine. Xenophanes was not an atheist, however, but proposed a substitute for the old anthropomorphic polytheism, and was a forerunner of monotheism. His one God is an intelligent superdeity beyond any human or physical description. One God, greatest among gods and men, not at all like mortals in body and mind. The one God is all-seeing, all-thinking, all-hearing, with a complete perception of the world. As a whole he sees, as a whole he thinks, and as a whole he hears. The one God is also motionless. Always he stays in the same place, not moving at all, nor is it fitting for him to travel in different directions at different times. Nevertheless, he is the cause of movement. With no effort at all, he keeps everything moving by the thinking of his mind. Here we find the reason for Aristotle's giving pride of place to Xenophanes in his metaphysics. Xenophanes seems to have been skeptical about existing human knowledge, at least widespread views about the world, and was famous for correcting people when speaking of the rainbow as the goddess Iris, with a little lesson on pre-Socratic optics. He seems to have been a forerunner of skepticism insofar as he's often self-critical and aware that even his own views are only an assumption. Opinion is stretched over all, and so no man has seen anything clearly, nor will there be anyone who knows about the gods and about what I say on everything. People will continue to speak in their own private opinions, regardless of whether any given philosopher is right. His ethical critique of the Greek gods is also combined with the doctrine of fiction. Clearly, if the mythic gods are immoral and shameful, we made them up, and what we have made up cannot properly be called divine. Plato will roll with this principle in books 2 and 3 of the Republic. Xenophanes' emphasis on God's otherness is sometimes considered puzzling or inconsistent. How can we know anything about a God who is wholly other? Many of the pre-Socratics provide non-mythical explanations, but it is in Xenophanes that we find philosophy as a properly anti-mythical activity, where natural philosophy or science and the criticism of superstition go hand in hand. He was one of the first to argue that truth is not a matter of divine inspiration, such as Homer or Hesiod received from a muse, but truth is found out through seeking, and it takes a long time to uncover. For the most part, we are groping inadequately within approximate understandings of the truth, and so must recognize our opinions not as true, but as truth's likeness. His skeptical bent may be better interpreted as an early fallibilism. There is no certainty, but there is a philosophical path and becoming more truth-like. Only the one God who is wholly other knows the truth and knows that he knows. Xenophanes is thus the first to separate divine or original intuition from finite or mortal intuition. In his context, this implies there is an unbridgeable gulf between humans and the gods. By the time of Immanuel Kant, it will become the division of the noumena, or thing in itself, and phenomena. Caratani, in the reading from last week, helps us get clearer that Xenophanes' critique of existing religion and positing of the one God as absolutely other means that God is beyond representation. This makes Ionian natural philosophy the origin of critiques of idolatry. The next thinker we're studying, and probably my favorite pre-Socratic, is Heraclitus of Ephesus. He's said to have written one book on nature, which covered all knowledge, metaphysical and scientific and political speculations in an oracular style. For Heraclitus, everything is composed of fire, pur, and logos, reason, which guides fire, and is equated with it. Reality unfolds through a ceaseless conflict of opposites regulated by unchanging law. So when you think Heraclitus, think fire doctrine as logos doctrine. One could say that the fiery aspect of the cosmos is its element of becoming, whereas the logos dimension is being. Later philosophy, beginning with Plato, will tend to simplify Heraclitus a bit too much and talk of him as the philosopher of becoming, a bit perhaps in the Buddhist sense of an eternal, interdependent origination. His most famous sayings, such as "you can't step in the same river twice," "all things flow," and "the sun is new each day." There is definitely a mystical aspect to Heraclitus' saying about rivers. Go and sit near a river and meditate on his saying. Will you be led to the conclusion that all reality is ceaselessly and eternally in flux, that the river is never the same as itself, and that there is no permanent presence or being underlying the world? Or will you rather be attuned to being itself in the play of flux? These are the questions which history asks itself in the name of Heraclitus. Known already in antiquity as the obscure one and the weeping philosopher, he dedicated and placed his book on Phusis in the temple of Artemis as a city treasure to be safeguarded. From his surviving fragments, of which we have many, over 100, he seems to be less of a proto-scientist and more of a political and religious reformer. Of course, with any thinker whose notoriously obscure interpretations of the meaning of his sayings varies widely. Constituting the bulk of the lecture today, we'll be looking at several important Heraclitus interpretations, those of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Fink, Etlury, Caratani, and our textbooks. Stamatelos reminds us that Socrates greatly appreciated Heraclitus even when he didn't understand him. His book may have been written in an obscure, enigmatic, or riddling way, precisely in order to choose its audience as those of spiritual rank. Wouldn't Socrates' words here be a great blurb on the back of a book? What I understood was great, and what I didn't understand seems great too. However, the reader needs to be an excellent diver, like those from Delos, to get to the bottom of it. On Heraclitus' fire doctrine, Stamatelos writes that it is exchanged in the same way as gold, which is traded, but sets the standard of the exchange. It is fire as logos which preserves the unity of the cosmos within everlasting cycles of alterations. Heraclitus' observations are particularly acute when it comes to the internal, hidden rhythms of nature, or phusis. and he unfolds these rhythms in his Logos. Heidegger used to say that the study of Heraclitus should begin with the Logos fragment B1. He thus concurs with Diehl's editorial decision to place it at the head. This is a powerful fragment which sounds almost Taoist. Of the Logos, which is as I describe it, people always prove to be uncomprehending, both before they have heard it and once they have heard it. For although all things happen according to the Logos, people act as if they had no experience of it. Even when they do experience such words and deeds as I explain, when I distinguish each thing according to its nature and declare how it is, but others fail to notice what they do after they wake up, just as they forget what they do when asleep. In this formulation, the Logos sounds like an explanatory principle or the Tao, tuned with the eternal transformations of nature. Those who are in the Tao or who have the Logos are able to engage these transformations with equanimity and understanding. Nevertheless, most people just don't get it and act in the proverbial phrase as if they have learned nothing. Another important starting point very close to his Logos and fire doctrine is Heraclitus' idea of the one and the many, or Hen Kai Pan. Fire and the Logos are one, but the events and sayings of them are many. An unusual aspect of Heraclitus' teaching is that it doesn't privilege vision as the keenest of senses. Its representation of the world is not optical. Indeed, we are more in tune with the one and the many with fire and Logos through our senses of hearing and smell, hearkening to the Logos in hearing and scenting out the nature of things through the smell they emit in their contact with fire. Sort of like incense at a religious ritual, as Heraclitus says, if all existing things turned to smoke, our nostrils would distinguish them. Vision merely shows us the outward trappings of a thing. Hearing and smell gets us closer to a thing's essence. In ethics, Heraclitus is most famous for teaching moderation or sophrosune, acknowledging that impulses are hard to fight and indulgence can harm the soul. Desire must be harnessed. We find this in Heraclitus as an ascetic tendency and preference of the dry over the wet. The soul that is dry is wizened and best, he writes, but the soul that is wet is drowning, childlike, and idiotic in the flow of things. Heraclitus' elitism is often pointed out by commentators. Those who want truth and Logos are heroism, seek everlasting fame, but the many, the herd, are glutted like cattle. On harmony, war, and unity, Heraclitus' thought is particularly profound. Ultimately, there is a harmonic world order, governed by Logos and fire. What they govern is a world of apparent pluralities in which there is opposition and conflict. A world of struggle or strife is one in which nature or physis loves to hide, or to conceal itself. What nature conceals is the hidden harmony and unity of strife. For harmony itself derives from opposing tensions and conflicts, and is expressed in the image of war, or the Greek term polemos, may be more literally translated as struggle. Polemos is the father of all and the king of all. Some he shows as gods, others as men, some he makes slaves, and others free. Strife and becoming have an originative function in Heraclitus' thought, and yet they are not applauded for their own sake, but rather for what they reveal. Nietzsche's Heraclitus interpretation, if we listen to Heidegger, is fun and productive, but just plain wrong. It revolves predominantly in the misconception that Heraclitus' biggest idea is becoming. His emphasis on Heraclitus as a thinker of becoming in a world of no fixed being is accurate, but misses the specific dynamism of Heraclitus' own idea of being. For Nietzsche, Heraclitus champions an opposition to Anaximander, for whom becoming is a mark of injustice. Existence is eternally unjustified, but in Heraclitus, existence is a game, a play, and an experiment. Becoming is innocent, beyond good and evil, and life or the world are the games that time plays with becoming. Not punishment of what has come to be did I see, but the justification of that which is coming into being. Heraclitus' metaphysical innovation over Anaximander is to renounce dualism. Fire and Logos are one, and commensurate throughout the field of eternal becoming. So far so good, but Nietzsche missteps in the second innovation he attributes to Heraclitus, that being is altogether to be denied. If we think of being as a tarrying, an indestructibility, and a bulwark in the stream, then Nietzsche is correct, but there are other ways to conceptualize being. For Nietzsche, Heraclitus' greatest talent is his extraordinary power to think intuitively. above all in three novel doctrines: the unity of opposites, cosmic strife, and invisible harmony. Due to his thinking of the unity of opposites and embrace of contradiction and paradox in his obscure sayings, Aristotle accused him of the highest crime before the tribunal of reason, to have sinned against the law of contradiction. But not all logics are Aristotelian. Several Indian and Chinese systems of logic do not posit the principles of identity and the principle of non-contradiction, and excluded middle as the end-all and be-all of the play of the world. Nietzsche traces Heraclitean cosmic strife or polemos back to the Greek idea of the agon or contest, as well as to Hesiod's good eris. The negative and the positive are locked in an eternal dance of mutual self-enhancing, where this becoming is always overseen by an invisible harmony. In Greek, the harmonia aphanes, which is stronger than the visible one we see, or logos that we see, is weaker and determined by a stronger harmony. The logos itself, or wisdom, which Heraclitus understands in terms of the lightning that steers into presence all things. As usual, Nietzsche's interpretations are influenced by Schopenhauer. He slots Heraclitean becoming into Schopenhauer's doctrine of the will, and the illusion of being into Schopenhauer's representation, locating in Heraclitus a fundamental pessimism about our ability to access the meaning of life. The fourth key idea of Heraclitus, important for Nietzsche, is the play of the world game. The world, cosmos, or in this case eon, time, is a game that Zeus plays, of fire with itself, fire and logos being the only fleeting unity, the endless plurality of play. Human beings will never be satisfied till they are reabsorbed into the world conflagration. The condition of individuation in time and space is one of desire, want, lack. Play stages this innocence of becoming, but only death reabsorbs us into the one. For Nietzsche, Heraclitus' most enduring legacy is his daring to break with Anaximander's moralistic doctrine of the world as unjust, and to rethink the whole play of the cosmos without any moral additive. Counts in our adherence or correspondence with the Logos is that we learn the various and always changing rules of the world game. Heidegger's account of Heraclitus in his 1926 lectures is less vivid and colorful than Nietzsche's, but more oriented by fundamental philosophical problems. Being is to be sought in becoming by means of opposition and physics. The world is without beginning or end means that our quest for being must always begin from the current configuration of the world. Change is always lawful and the same. Fire, or Heraclitus' material principle explanation, is only thinkable in terms of the transcendental hen to sophon or logos. Fire is only the form of appearance of cosmic reason, not the world in and of itself. Only the logos or being can claim that distinction. Heidegger, Heraclitus, and Parmenides, far from being opposed as the thinkers of becoming versus being, had the same problem: how to disclose and discuss the being of beings. In previous pre-Socratic philosophy, a being was always the focus, like water or air, the apeiron or earth. But how should we understand becoming itself? If it is a mode of being, then what is being? Heraclitus' core insights include for Heidegger that opposition is not mere difference, but a counter-striving within unity. Oppositionality constitutes the very being of beings. Here, Heidegger locates the difference between Heraclitus and Parmenides. In Parmenides, opposites exclude one another. The one is not the other. One member of the pair of opposites is called being, and the other non-being, a deprivation. Only the positive side of the opposition properly is. But in Heraclitus, opposites condition one another. One is also the other, and the counter-striving things harmonize. Thus, opposition itself is the essence of things. And only through engagement with oppositionality do we encounter the true world. Heidegger's Heraclitus interpretation is developed further briefly in Being and Time, several lecture courses of the 1930s, although these tend to focus more on Anaximander. Heidegger's most developed lecture series on Heraclitus was delivered in 1941, entitled The Inception of Occidental Thinking, Logic, Heraclitus' Doctrine of the Logos. For Heidegger, who thinkers like Parmenides and Heraclitus are, is determined solely from out of what they thought, not biographies, so Nietzsche's method is misguided. He composed a quite lively description of the character of Heraclitus, but at the same time brought into circulation the most awful misinterpretation of Heraclitus' thinking. In an ironic mode, therefore, Heidegger begins here from two biographical stories of Heraclitus to inquire what they really tell us. In the first story, Heraclitus received some visitors at his house. Coming near, they saw him as he warmed himself by an oven. Some obscene commentators suggest that he was masturbating. Either way, the visitors were very surprised to find him compromised, but he greeted them warmly and bid them to have courage and enter with the words, "Here too the gods come to presence." In the second story, he had withdrawn to the temple of Artemis to play knucklebones with the children. The Ephesians gawked at him, and he said, "What are you gaping at, scoundrels? Is it not better to do this than to work with you on behalf of the polis?" What's happening in the first story, according to Heidegger, is that the visitors expect to find the exceptional thinker in deep meditation or doing something fitting of his stature. Instead, they find him living the usual day-to-day life of ordinary people. Passing over the obscene interpretations, Heidegger underlines the oven as a place where baking bread happens. He simply points out that this scene of the cold thinker warming himself by the fire indicates the whole indigence of life. The sight of a freezing thinker offers little interest. Heraclitus reads this disappointment on the face of his visitors, but bids them to enter with the words "Inai gar kai and tauta theus." Not to worry, here too the gods come to presence. Thinking the word theoi and the experience of the divine in an indigenous Greek way as spiritual, uncanny, or demonic, Heidegger understands Heraclitus' invitation to mean that the visitors should join him in peering into the ordinary in such a way that what peers both into and out of the ordinary is the extraordinary. The gods who presence even in the region of ordinary things. And more, his statement even here, that is at the oven, not only does the presencing of gods unfold, but it unfolds in an exceptional way. That is, in the inconspicuousness of the everyday. Philosophy is not about chasing after the eccentric, the exciting, or the tantalizing, but it is a remaining near to the fire. The Greek pur, which means light and glow. Strife constitutive of the world and necessary for its unfolding isn't simply the strife of a battlefield, but begins in the day-to-day. The thinker resides in a nearness to this strife, even by the oven. In the letter on humanism, Heidegger returns to this biographical anecdote in order to interpret the key Heraclitus fragment, ethos anthropos daimon, usually translated as "a man's character or way of life is his destiny," and more literally, "the character of a man is his guardian spirit." Ethos, the way of life, anthropos, of man, is daimon, or spiritual, or the ethos of a man is determined by his daimon. Man's familiar abode is the region open to the coming of the gods, the unfamiliar to presence. Heraclitus is a thinker of going into nearness, that is, experiencing the ethos of the human as what it is, in a nearness to the sight of the demonic. Act as if everything is familiar, but the world is in fact very mysterious, and we have to go into nearness with all things as one to access the logos that reveals all things. That is the mortal ethos. The second story finds Heraclitus in his favorite place playing knucklebones with the kiddos. Again, a crowd is gaping at him. But this is not an everyday and modest place. Rather, it's the holy precinct of the Temple of Artemis. This, unlike the oven, is a decisively holy place. And yet, the thinker does not concern himself much with the goddess. Rather, he plays a dice game. For Heidegger, what links these two stories is the nearness to the gods. It seems to be of crucial importance to Heraclitus. In both cases, he experiences this nearness in the opposite way to what is expected, indeed inappropriately. In the first story, he is welcoming and hospitable, but in the second, scornful and dismissive. This tale is often interpreted politically as his rejection of the polis by means of absurdity. Heidegger notes that concern for the highest presence of the gods is the essence of the polis, that Heraclitus is thus being authentically political. Heidegger wonders whether nearness to the gods in Heraclitus' case means nearness to the world game, and that even thinking is revealed to us in something like a play. That Artemis becomes Heraclitus' patron goddess, both since she is the patron goddess of Ephesus, and because of the focus of his thinking on nature or phusis, is also significant. It's not that Heraclitus is near to the gods in general, or presents a casual theology, for religion and theology in the modern senses have not yet been invented. Rather, Heraclitus, as an authentically political thinker, draws near to a goddess. This This is the same place that during the late Greek period Paul went to on his mission, preaching to the Ephesians, and where they routed him out, chanting for 2 hours that Artemis rules in Ephesus. Here you see the ruins of the contemporary sanctuary and a reconstruction, as well as the form Artemis takes here, particularly close to fertility and nature. Who is Artemis? Sister of Apollo, both were born on the island of Delos, or in another account, Artemis was born on Ortugia. Both carried the same symbols, the lyre and the bow. In existing Heraclitean fragments, both these symbols are discussed. In general, the lyre is the symbol of string music and its harmonia. Artemis is usually considered as a huntress, but what is really being emphasized is her belonging to the play of nature, to Phusis. Artemis is the goddess of Phusis, the topic on which Heraclitus wrote his text. Her playmates, the nymphs, play the game of Phusis. Phusis means, in Heidegger's reading, the self-opening, coming forth and emerging up and upwards into unconcealed, standing there and rising. The goddess Artemis is the rising one, hence she appears in elevated form. Her beauty is lofty and stately, and the maidens to whom she is well disposed she gives great stature. Not just lyre and bow, but Artemis also carries a torch, or torches in both hands, and is thus called Phosphoros, or the light bringer. The essence of Phusis is indeed an emerging and self-expanding into the open and the lighted. Heidegger reading Nature Loves to Hide, or the darkness and obscurity of Phusis, in terms of how can you hide from that which never sets. That is the dawning and the rising. In an existential way, Artemis can thus be said to symbolize the inceptual hidden essence of aletheia, or truth. That is the play between concealing and unconcealing. Lethe being oblivion and darkness, and aletheia being an unhiding, or even a remembrance. And so Heidegger is the conclusion of his remarks on Artemis, reading her as emergence, light and play. The lyre and the bow unfold an essential metonymy. On the one hand, playful string music, on the other hand, the bow that sends arrows, bringing death. But the deaths that her arrow sends are sudden, gentle, and loving. This is a reference to Artemis's status in Greek religion as a kurotrophic deity, singling out the youth she loves for great becomings and deeds, but also bringing death to those who violate or disrespect her. In all these significations of the goddess Artemis, her emerging, self-illuminating play is connected to the essence of Zoe, or life, those who are most alive among the living. Heraclitus' notion of Phusis as well focuses on life and death, and his doctrine of fire is referred to as living fire. The life of the universe and animals and all living things is described in the Greek language in terms of Zoe. The qualified life of human beings in the polis, however, is bios. Heraclitus' cosmos of logos as fire is in some ways a naturalization, genealogical account of the emergence of human cultural life, or bios, against the backdrop of an all-encompassing Zoe, or Phusis, overseen by the goddess Artemis. Poetics of nearness or farness are also built into her identity as a goddess. One of her epithets is the far darter. She appears in her ultimate nearness precisely from out of farness. Greeks thought nearness and farness as intimately connected in this way. Lastly, recall that Heraclitus brought his book on Phusis precisely to the sanctuary of Artemis in order to shelter it there. Heidegger, Nietzsche's view of Heraclitus, as original as it was and profound, was obscured by Schopenhauer, who he calls Nietzsche's downfall, merely an accomplished novelist who gives only a dim view of philosophy. Hegel is in fact the Heraclitus standard to beat, and it is Hegel who refutes Cicero's vapid opinion of Heraclitus's deliberate opaqueness. However, even Hegel can't resist criticizing Heraclitus for not yet attaining to the concept. Rather than thinking with Hegel of Heraclitus as on his way to the concept but not quite there yet, Heidegger wants to understand Heraclitus on Phusis, play and death. In order to do this, of course, the starting point must be logos. However, we cannot learn to hear the logos except through our engagement with oppositionality as essencing. The attempt to consider what is for the inceptual thinker Heraclitus the to be thought will encounter light and fire, play and life, and will discover strife in all of them. As a systematic reader of the Heraclitean fragments, it seems Nietzsche would receive a C-, according to Heidegger. Must begin from the logos as being, as laying bare the being of a world, which being is only ever discovered in the form of oppositionality. That philosophy must begin from logos is already treated in Being and Time, the oldest fragment of philosophical doctrine which explicitly treats the logos. You cannot get anywhere with thinking without logos as a phenomena of truth in the sense of discoveredness or unconcealment. We should not in the first instance translate logos as meaning or discourse or rationale or argument, or especially not logic. Rather, the logos is the message, the subtle order, the hidden harmony, the way, and even the wisdom of Zeus. We sometimes confuse logos and legein, the message and the speaking of it. It is through the logos that Heraclitus speaks, but each speaking is a legein, and is treated as such by the uncomprehending. However, to those who are awake, there is a single and therefore common world, while those who are asleep turn towards a world all their own. Logos, unlike legein, is thus trans-perspectival, rather than merely perspectival. There are many fascinating fragments on sleeping and waking in Heraclitus to help us understand what he means in the Logos fragment and elsewhere. In the night, a man kindles a light because his sight is quenched. While living, he touches on the dead. During sleep, while awake, he touches on the sleeper. This underlines the closeness of sleep and death, our continuity with the ancestral dead, as well as the closeness of waking and sleeping. In our lives, guided by the Logos, we must not act and speak like men asleep. For like the common world, we share together, which is not the world of our private dreams. What is in us is the same, living and dead, awake and sleeping, as well as young and old. These opposites conditioning each other and being, in the first and final analysis, one and the same process. Only the Logos, cosmic order, or Zeus, the one who alone is wise, is a principle of true awakening, of the unity of the soul in both private and common worlds. Heraclitus' distinction between private and common worlds being an early formulation of Parmenides' two paths of being and non-being. This sounds a lot more like a doctrine of being than becoming. The 1944 Aletheia essay, summarizing various moments of the 1941 lectures, Heidegger connects fragment B1 to fragment B16. How can you hide from that which never sets? Which is also closely connected to fragment B123, Phusis cryptesthai philae, possible translations being, nature is friendly with concealing, nature loves to hide, the self-revealing attunes to self-concealing. A related and famous fragment here, the god whose oracle is at Delphi, neither reveals nor conceals, but gives a sign. Heidegger will render the Phusis cryptesthai philae fragment a little more prolixly. Rising out of self-concealing bestows favor upon self-concealing. The Greek is compact, so there are endless retranslations, and his aphorism seems tied up with so many notions, the secret of nature, or the goddess of nature, such as Artemis or Isis who veils herself. And there is that famous inscription on the temple of Isis at Sais, I am all that was, all that is, and all that will be, and no mortal has drawn the veil from before my face. Pierre Hadot, who wrote our textbook, What is Ancient Philosophy, also wrote this book, The Veil of Isis, an essay on the history of the idea of nature, which begins from this fragment of Heraclitus and gives us a masterful interpretation of it through the centuries, all the way to Heidegger's original interpretation. I would highly recommend that book for a final essay topic. A few moments from it. For thousands of years, philosophers, theologians, poets, scholars, and magicians have puzzled over Heraclitus' saying, everything hinges on how we understand the first word, phusis. The word phusis, however, has evolved considerably between Heraclitus' time and our own. Every age reinvents its own concept of nature, its own private delusion regarding what nature, phusis, cosmos really are. In Heraclitus' time, phusis expressed as noun the action in the verb phuisthai, to be born, to increase, to grow, and to result. Phusis is natural or vegetal becoming, the shoot that grows, and the shoot that has finished growing. Hadot writes, the fundamental image expressed in this word is thus that of a springing forth of things, an appearance or manifestation of things that results from this spontaneity. Heidegger thinks the key to understanding this famous Phusis fragment is B16. How can you hide from that which never sets? How could anyone remain hidden before it, that is, before the clearing? This fragment could also sound a bit like the midnight sun of the Pythagoreans and mystics of all ages, the notion that our sun sets, but the true sun, the invisible sun, never sets. This would be to project back onto Heraclitus a Platonic conception of the sun. Heidegger rather sticks to the words in the fragment. There is no hiding from or being concealed before the never setting, which is always rising. He calls this never setting, always rising, phusis, nature, and also aletheia, truth. For Heidegger, Heraclitus' logos is the languaging or clearing, letting stand forth of phusis. In other words, logos equals aletheia. Logos, aletheia are unconcealing or truthing, truth as a verb. Once again, perhaps Heraclitus' logos is not really about isolated becoming at all, but about all-encompassing being. In his analysis of the unity of opposites in Heraclitus, Heidegger privileges the polemos fragments, of course, again translating them with his signature style. Polemos, contention, the clearing, shows some of those present to be gods, others to be men. It brings some to appearance as slaves, others as free. Polemos reveals the invisible truth of things, bringing about the relationship or gathering and diverging of opposites, and thereby revealing their oneness. In this analysis, Heidegger is not far from Nietzsche, and he in fact placed the lightning fragment as an inscription over his cabin in the Black Forest. On the world play fragment, aion doesn't mean the world or the cosmos in that fragment so much as world time, great sending of being in time or an epoch. And he writes in a 1934 lecture, history is the monumental play that the gods play with the peoples and with the people. For the great times and eras of world history are a play, according to the word of an ancient Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, whom they called the Obscure One, and whose most profound thoughts were thought anew precisely by the poet Friedrich Hölderlin. The time of the world, a child it is, a player moving the board pieces. To and fro of a child is sovereignty over being. In such play of the gods stands the earth. Etymologically, io means vital force. It's a duration of time, not the time of eternity, or time in the sense of chronos. In the classic duality of chronos versus kairos, or the passage of time versus the historical moment, aion is more on the side of kairos and is a history inaugurating and history preserving play. The next topic we should look at in more detail in Heraclitus is Thanatos. Having just underlined that Heraclitus' doctrine of becoming can be more correctly understood as a doctrine of transformational temporality, and asks how the transcendent logos doctrine and the flux doctrine become possible in the first place, arguing that it is Heraclitus' use of the word thanatos to integrate two different orders of temporality that is the key. On the one hand, there is the unchanging temporality enshrined in logos, everything is always one and the same, and on the other, there is the temporality of the transformations of fire, manifest as flux. Thanatos is the bridge between fire and logos, becoming and being. This is a curious insight, and Vishva Adluri, contemporary philosopher who has written several books, including the edited volume you see to the right, and the introduction to that work, a careful analysis of all the instances of Thanatos cognates in the Heraclitean fragments. It appears as Thenesko, Apothnesko, and Tethniotis. Luri gives us the startling observation that actually Thanatos is the most frequently used word in the Heraclitean fragments, occurring a total of 12 times. It's not only the most frequent theme, outnumbering Suke, Logos, and Hen, but also the most philosophically significant for Adluri. Heraclitus relates death to the life and degeneration of men, to souls, to fate, to ever-flowing fame, to religious ritual, to sleep, and to the gods. And yet there is nothing morbid or otherworldly about Heraclitus' extended meditation on death. Even though humans cannot anticipate or comprehend what awaits them after death, death is of the deepest philosophical significance. As mortals, our temporality is defined by the paradoxical presence of death in life. Adluri thus concludes so stunningly that I'm just going to read it to you. Thanatos imbues the Heraclitean universe with a surprisingly complex temporality. His is not a simple universe of eternal being, nor is it one of rapid flux. Instead, Heraclitus attempts to construct a mortal temporality with mortal life as the basic temporal phenomena. He then paradoxically unites life and death, flux and stable logos. His meditations on time unfold a pan-mortal point of view that includes an account of both mortals and immortals, and thus flux and transcendence. Thanatos, rather than logos, defines and describes time as we mortals experience it, and by extension, the cosmos which we mortals inhabit. Logos serves as a counterpoint. In some ways, what Al-Luri is doing here is revisiting a debate that happened in the 1960s between Heidegger and one of his students, Eugen Fink. The 1966-67 Heraclitus seminar, billed as a collaborative event, but most of the sessions being led by Fink, devolves by the end into a difference of opinion, Heidegger taking issue with much of Fink's interpretation. In earlier sessions, he expresses concern that Fink sets out from the fragments concerning fire, cosmos, and lightning, but not from logos and aletheia. By the 9th and 10th sessions, Fink had the opportunity to lay out where his interpretation was coming from. Unfortunately, Heidegger was not in attendance. He returns in the 10th session and offers his critique. I find Fink's interpretation fairly in line with Al-Luri's, Al-Luri perhaps going one or two steps further. Before we cover that ground, let's look at the main Thanatos fragments that Al-Luri mentions. All that we see when we waken is death. All that we see while sleeping is life. This directly connects Thanatos to the common world of the Logos. Next, the greater the death, the greater the reward, which sounds like an encomium to the great death, also can be understood as the benefit that accrues to those who die in life. Next, there awaits men after they are dead, things which they do not anticipate or imagine, suggesting that Heraclitus had a complex view of the afterlife. Remember Heraclitus' doctrine that the dry soul is wizened and best, but the wet soul like a drunk man being led by a child? The watery isn't all bad in Heraclitus. For souls, it is death to become water. Death here having a positive and negative aspect. For water, death to become earth, but from earth, water is born, and from water, soul. Even the philosopher of dryness and fire acknowledges the necessity of water for life and soul. Next, a famous Heraclitean pun. The bow, bios, is called life, bios, but its work is death. And what I find to be the most interesting of all the Heraclitean fragments, immortals, mortals, mortals, immortals, each lives the death of the other and dies their life. This is going to turn out to be the central fragment of Fink's interpretation. We'll return to it in a moment. In the next, we see further association of Thanatos or death with transformation. Fire lives the death of earth, air lives the death of fire, water lives the death of air, earth that of water. Lastly, it is delight, or rather death, for souls to become wet. We live the death of wet souls, and they live our death. This fragment making sense in terms of the saying that the soul is a spark of starry essence. That is, a little bit of divine fire. This is where the 9th session of the Heraclitus seminar picks up, summarizing the previous session, the problem of the transformations of fire, whether the change of an original stuff is thereby thought, or whether a relatedness of the one and the many is aimed at. What the 9th and 10th sessions are going to try to understand is the dark formula, difficult to comprehend, that something lives the death of another thing. What does this mean? Key fragment to work this out is fragment 62, in Greek, athanatoi, thanatoi, thanatoi, athanatoi, zontes ton ekainon thanaton, ton de ekainon bion tethniotis. In an English translation of the deals, immortal, mortal, mortal, immortal, for the life of these is the death of those, and the life of those is the death of these. This translation is altogether too symmetrical. The words Heraclitus uses for life and death are different in each part of the fragment. If we don't think the semantic differences here, completely miss the meaning of the saying. The first part of the saying here, athanatoi, thanatoi, refers to this part of the fragment, zontes ton ekainon thanaton. And these words here, thanatoi, athanatoi, ton de ekainon bion tethniotes. Translating on the fly, immortal, mortal. The life, zontes, of the immortals, that is the life of the gods, using the Greek term zoe, that is the universal life of fire and phusis. The zontes, or life of the gods, emerges from out of the death of mortals here being thanaton. So basically the gods have no living presence or life without our death, possibly in the literal sense of our actual death, and possibly as our initiatory death in life. The gods depend on us in this chiasmic fragment. They are not completely separate from the human sphere, but rather they feed and live off of human initiatory and real death. Their eternity or immortality being a product of our mortal finitude. So the immortals have Zoe, and the mortals have death, Thanatos. But look at the second half of the fragment. How do the mortals relate to the immortals within our form of life, that is human life or qualified life in a culture or a polis? The gods experience death, tethniotis, which might mean something more like being entombed. So all at once, the immortal living life of the gods is predicated on the death of mortals. Our specific way of life, however, is the gods being dead or being entombed. So far from being the first thinkers to say God is dead, both Hegel and Nietzsche owe this specific thought to a Heraclitean fragment. Mortal life is the realm of living at the expense of the divine forces of fire, phusis, zoe, etc. This specific relationship between mortals and immortals, mutual dependency in the experiences of life and death, is what makes sense of the phrase, to live the death of, to die the life of. Gods live the death of humans and mortals die the life of the gods. This is just one example of what happens in terms of complexity and profound interest when we start to look at the actual Greek and compare translations. Session 10, Heidegger provides a critique of a similar interpretation to that fragment. Sees Fink as offering an existence ontology, not just of humans in relation to the gods, but vice versa, of gods in relation to humans. The epiphany of the gods is no unveiling of the gods, but a masking in human life. Heidegger wants to bring it back to hen panta, that is, a standing open of gods and mortals in reference to death. And he recalls Hölderlin's Hyperion and its citation of Heraclitus's fragment, the one differentiated in itself, hen diapharon iotu. There's no real disagreement here, but rather a difference of emphasis. Heidegger, as a close reader of Hölderlin that he is, humanity is nearer to the abyss of death than the gods. The key for Heidegger is to emphasize with Hölderlin that although humans and gods are unity in difference, observing their strict distinction involves the standing open of gods and mortals, just Heraclitus teaches is accessible in the counter-turning phenomena of mortal death. Mortals die and the gods live forever. But the gods can be said to die in a sense throughout the vagaries of the human life upon which they depend for the sustenance of their emotion. It seems to me like Etluri was inspired by this exchange between Heidegger and Fink. His focus on Thanatos, without which we cannot even hearken to the Logos as counterpoint. Just a few more quotable quotes from Heraclitus on Greek religion, showing yet again that the tendency to understand the pre-Socratic philosophers as logical or rational thinkers against religion is really misguided. Heraclitus seems to have indeed been a critic of existing forms of Greek religion and cult in the fragment Night Ramblers, Magicians, Bacchantes, Maenads, Mystics. The rites accepted by mankind in the mysteries are an unholy performance, and yet he is positively brimming with praise for many aspects of Greek religious cult, such as when he says, "The Sibyl with raving mouth, uttering mirthless, unadorned, unperfumed sayings, reaches 1,000 years with her voice because of the god." Heraclitus's hearkening to the Logos and obscure sayings seem to be modeled in part on Sibylline oracles and the Pythia, hardly a merely philosophical performance. Again, criticizing existent religion, specifically the arrival of Bacchic cults to the area of Ephesus, he says, "For if it were not to Dionysus that they made a procession and sang a hymn to the genitals, they would act more disgracefully. But Hades, god of the underworld, and Dionysus, god of festivity and initiatory joy, whom they madly celebrate in their Bacchic rites, are the same." Hades and Dionysus being the same mythologically, also alluded to in the most famous of the Heraclitean fragments, becoming a foundational statement for Western Hermeticism. The way up and the way down are the same. Clearly, Heraclitus does not simply reject the Dionysian religion, he just thinks it doesn't really know what it's doing. And lastly, Heraclitus has a highly quotable conception of God. God is day-night, winter-summer, war-peace, satiety-famine, but he changes like fire, which when it mingles with the smoke of incense, is named according to each man's pleasure. This sounds a lot like Xenophanes, now framed within the doctrine of the unity of opposites. Again, the faculty of smell and hearing are privileged. Again, most people really aren't up tuning to the Logos or Heraclitus's philosophy. This is to be expected. Every four-footed beast is driven to pasture by the gods with blows. Interesting reference here to the Indo-European idea of four-footedness versus two-footedness. The notion that mortals look like they're walking around on 2 feet. In fact, without the logos, they're mere cattle of the gods being driven around. Anticipating Greek tragic thought in the Athenian age, and looking back to older pessimistic myth of the Bronze Age, Heraclitus writes, "Hubris has more need to be extinguished than a raging fire." Clearly, hubris or egoism tunes us out of the logos. One of my favorite sayings, the kukaion stands still by moving. Kukaion is the ritual drink of Demeter. According to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, a concoction of water, barley, mint, and pennyroyal, likely a beer of some sort, administered during the rituals of Demeter in the temple of Eleusis. Prior to receiving initiation into the great mysteries, all the initiates drink the kukaion, the evidence having become pretty decisive, despite conservative objections in philology, that it was a potent psychedelic brew of some kind. Saying that the kukaion stands still by moving is a reference to its potent essence, the barley or other ingredients floating around in the mixture, and that being precisely what makes the kukaion the kukaion. It could also be a reference to the being or the world that the kukaion opens up to the initiates, one in which staying still under its influence opens out to the phantasmagoria of the world. Here in the initiations of Demeter and in everyday life, such as by the oven, the lightning steers all things. Lastly, his response to the Delphic saying, "Know thyself," Heraclitus writes, "I searched into myself." Heraclitus' understanding of the cosmos is also musical. Collections, wholes not wholes, brought together, pulled apart, sung in unison, sung in conflict, from all things one and from one all things. His death is related in Diogenes and is probably not to be trusted, but is interesting. Suffering from dropsy, he apparently followed an old remedy by lying in a pile of dung. Therein he died. A saying of his can be connected here: the fairest order or the most beautiful world or cosmos is, in the final analysis, a random garbage heap. I guess it seems fitting that Heraclitus' spurious death is a raging dumpster fire of shit, especially for the thinker who said that the fairest world or most beautiful cosmos is itself a random shit heap. What are our biggest takeaways from Heraclitus? Well, regardless of Nietzsche's emphasis on the innocence of becoming, could be that in the Heraclitean vision of the world, justice too prevails. If it applies to the course of the sun, surely it applies to us. Cultivate sophrosune so that we're not led around drunk by an immature boy. Perhaps most helpfully is this very enigmatic saying that sleepers are workers and contributors to the creativity of the world. So we should not see waking and sleeping as ethically opposed, but honor the work that is being done by the sleepers, the dreamers. Without them, the world would be a less beautiful place. And lastly, the foundational fragment of Heraclitus for Freudian psychoanalysis: nobody knows the depth of the psyche, so far is its nature extended. It is from out of this fragment in particular that Freud developed the doctrine of the unconscious. So our last thinker for this week is Pythagoras of Samos. Pythagoras of Samos is a very different type of thinker than Heraclitus in many ways. Here we'll be studying him mostly as a precursor to Plato and Plato's theory of ideas. For Pythagoras, the prime element is number. Number is abstract and transcendental, like Anaximander's infinity, but also very specific, the number one. Being itself is number, or mathematics in dynamical interplay. Exoterically, we see math, number, at work in the movement of the planets, music, physics. And there's debate in Pythagorean commentators whether the study of math is exoteric preparation for the true esoteric initiations, whatever those were, or vice versa. Pythagoras is the discoverer that if you half the length of a string on a lyre, you produce a note 1 octave higher. And Pythagorean communities seem to have a musical as well as a mathematical intention. He's most significant for the history of philosophy as metaphysics because he is the beginner of a two-world theory, sensible and intelligible, physical nature being the expression of intelligible numbers. And he was definitely more mystical, if not a little out there, in his theory of the soul. It is an intelligible unity that undergoes transmigration into other forms after death. Whatever comes into existence is always born again. Pythagoras may have adopted this idea from the wheel of samsara in India, where he's said to have visited. His name is chiefly remembered through having invented the Pythagorean theorem regarding right-angled triangles, but we're really not sure if he did that. As an ethical thinker, he's most remembered for promoting vegetarianism and for critiquing sacrifice in the polis as a bloody and needless affair. This links Pythagoras with Orphic communities in the region, as well as with the doctrine of soma sema, the body is a prison. The golden sayings of Pythagoras, which have survived, we find some pretty unusual prohibitions, such as one must abstain from eating beans because beans are parents' heads. Pythagoras flourished around 540 BCE. He was born on the island of Samos and traveled, it was said, for many years in Egypt and the Orient, and was thus influenced by Oriental thought. Most of the information we have is dubious and comes from later biographies and hagiographies, although written by eminent thinkers in their own right, such as Porphyry's Vita Pythagorae and Iamblichus's De Vita Pythagorica. There seems to be agreement that Pythagoras had two groups of students in his community, those who had permission only to attend and listen to his lectures, the akousmatikoi, and those who could participate in the inner circle and the lessons of the school, the mathematikoi. Again, sometimes the hierarchy is inverted here in the commentators. Pythagoras indeed brought about radical change to the explanation of the cosmos and the nature of the soul, but his principal contribution was the creation of the Pythagorean way of life, and how that later morphed into other types of philosophical communities. Pythagoreans followed strict practical rules and prohibitions, shared their possessions, meals, readings, and exercises, and placed special focus on the study of mathematics, music, and philosophy. Pythagorean harmonics posits that the structure of the universe can be understood through the sacred symbol of the tetrachus, or tetraches, which is the cause and root of everything, the fount of ever-flowing nature. What is the tetraches? Basically, the first four numbers. So Pythagoras has a kind of fourfold theory of primal origin. Add 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and the sum is 10. Many a mystical Hermetic text throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance makes much of this. His principle of explanation for the cosmos is not material causality, but mathematical relation and structure. Number is the eternal principle that animates all things, and the power of number is realized and expressed in the world, in the soul, and in everything that is. As the tetraches explains the world, so the one or monad is the basis of theology. And a bit like astrologists do, the Pythagoreans were said to have decked out gods and traditional symbols with numerical appellations. According to Plutarch, the monad was identified with Apollo, the sun god, and it's noteworthy that Pythagoras was given the nickname the Hyperborean Apollo. And the monad was sometimes also identified with the hearth fire at the center of the universe. Clearly, Pythagoras wasn't just a philosopher, but a religious founder. In the Pythagorean table of opposites reported by Aristotle, there are 10 pairs of opposites, where the first column signifies the positive and the second the negative. Tables of categories like this are going to become an enduring feature of the history of metaphysics. Another interesting aspect about Pythagoras and his legacy, it's the first time in ancient Greek philosophy or pre-Socratic philosophy when women figure prominently. He is reported to have derived a great part of his ethical teaching from Themistoclea, the reigning priestess at Delphi. His daughter Arignote and wife Theano of Crotona were prominent and respected philosophers in their own right. Arignote is said to have thought that the eternal essence of number is the most providential cause of the whole heaven, earth, and region in between. Likewise, it is the root of the continued existence of the gods and daimones, as well as of divine men. Theano says that all that exists and is real can be determined through enumeration, and number is the cause of all things. Alcmaeon of Croton was a disciple of Pythagoras who became a notable philosopher in his own right, so scholars look to him to learn a bit more about what Pythagoras taught. In medicine, he's remembered as having explained the concept of isonomia as a state of balance between opposite powers in the body, such as wet, dry, cold, hot, sweet, bitter. Health is a product of isonomia, but not of monarchia, that is, absolute rule of any part of the body over any other. Isonomia produces health, monarchia in the body disease. Pythagoras is said to have been the first to use the term cosmos for the sum of the whole as an ordered, beautiful, harmonious world. Music is the finest expression of a mathematical cosmos in the musical harmony of the spheres, or music of the spheres. The circular course of the stars at night is guided by 9 celestial spheres, each of which produces a specific harmonic sound. which in deep ritual initiations is audible and thus became a mystical mathematical trope across the history of Western religious consciousness. According to the Testimonia from Strobius, the Pythagorean universe is unique or singular and pneumatic or spiritual. From the infinite, it draws in time, breath, and void, which distinguishes the places of separate things. The heavens are generated in a limited temporality, which in turn derives from an eternal and unlimited breath, the pneuma, or spirit that surrounds the universe. The cosmos is an eternal living organism that breathes in and out, inhaling, anapnein, and exhaling the surrounding void, kenon, we hear in Aristotle's physics. The cosmic void extends infinitely in every direction throughout the spherical cosmos, and the structure of universal order originates in the dynamic application of the finite numbers to the infinitude of the spirit or pneuma. The Pythagoreans are among the first to claim that Earth is spherical, and they added the 5 celestial zones and identified the evening star with the morning star, a discovery which is Babylonian in origin and often attributed to many pre-Socratic philosophers. Damatellos writes, it's also noteworthy that the early Pythagoreans denied the geocentric and geostatic model of the universe. They placed fire and not earth at the center of the cosmos. Thus the earth became a celestial body like others, creating day and night by its circular motion around Hestia, Hestia meaning hearth, the fire at the center of the universe. In ethics, Pythagoras is most remembered for his purifications or katharmoi of the soul, and seems to be important for Platonic ethics, inherited from Socrates in the doctrine that virtue is harmony. Plato testifies to the fact that Pythagoras instituted a recommended way of life, or bios, known as the Pythagorean way of life. The virtuous soul purifies itself through music, mathematics, and an appropriate diet. If you visit Greece in the modern day and age and go to the museum shop at Eleusis or Delphi, you'll always find a copy of Pythagoras' Golden Verses, some of which read a little bit weirdly religious, but many of which are quite inspiring. Classical scholar Peter Kingsling made and rested his reputation on a book on Empedocles and the Pythagorean tradition that's still very worth reading, and the field of Pythagoras studies has seen a boom of interest and industry in more recent decades as well. In light of his focus on politics and isonomia, Caratani looks to Pythagoras primarily as a figure of social reform. The goal was to restore isonomia. The situation in Samos at the time was one of increasing democratization. But here, democracy quickly gave way to tyranny as Polycrates assumed bit by bit the power of the tyrant. Pythagoras criticized his friend and left the island of Samos. After leaving Samos, he led an itinerant life, and various accounts have him visiting basically everywhere. He returned not to Samos in Ionia, but to the Italian city of Croton at the age of around 60, and at that point established his esoteric order. Both Plato and Diogenes of Laertius underlined the connection between Pythagoras and isonomia, especially in the saying, friendship is equality. Caratani further explains Pythagorean transmigration in terms of the Orphic soma sema. Embodiment in this terrestrial medium we call life is in fact nothing other than the death of the soul. We must regain our original divine nature or remain forever trapped in the cycle of death and rebirth. In order to end the cycle, the soul must gain knowledge, Sophia, very Eastern ideas indeed. On some accounts, Pythagoras is the first to use the term philosophia, which in this context would mean that the Western origin of the term philosophy, hardly Western at all, but a means of releasing the soul from transmigration. Another famous saying of Pythagoras, often quoted, is that he compared life to the festival games where the spectator is in the most desirable position. To be a spectator rather than a competitor means grasping the truth through contemplation or theoria. Thinking of the philosopher on the model of the Greek institution of the theoros, or emissary or messenger sent to a festival or other religious event in order to be a witness, is inherited in Platonic, Aristotelian, and later Greek thought in a variety of ways. In the words of Thomas Tweed, theory is travel. Pythagorean transmigration seems to have also been influential for Plato, who discusses it in the Phaedrus, in the Myth of Air, at the end of the Republic, and a few other places. For both Pythagoras and Plato, the soul is immortal, and it must recover its knowledge of the transcendental world through recollection and amnesis. Pythagoras probably got the transmigration from a combination of Indian thought and Orphism itself perhaps deriving it from further east. George Thompson argues that the Pythagorean cult community flourished in southern Italy because of the backwardness of the region. This was a place where you could found a new religion and not worry about the cosmopolitan Hellenistic norms on the mainland. Thompson also notes a difference between Ionian natural philosophy and Pythagoras in the intense religious fervency in Pythagorean communities with their faith in prophecy and miracles, noting in this way they resembled the Hebrews, who also, owing to the circumstances of their history, had kept in touch with their tribal origins. Karatani grants that intense religiosity, prophecy, miracles, and why not transmigration, not newfangled ideas in the rational Greek context, but rather popular folk notions, which in part explain the ease with which Orphic and Pythagorean communities sank roots into the Italian peninsula. Indeed, the order of Pythagoras bears resemblance to an Orphic cult. There are important differences. The tutelary deity of Orphism remained Dionysus, but Pythagoras emphasized Apollo, the guardian deity of many Ionian cities. Karatani agrees that his turn to mysticism came from political frustration. However, after settling in Croton, far from withdrawing into hermetic contemplation, he turned again to active social practice. The Pythagorean communities were political, resisting both tyranny and the free exercise of individual will. In fact, democratic political autonomy inevitably slides into an authoritarian system that suppresses the very freedom of the people. A Pythagorean notion we'll see richly developed in Plato, as well as the notion that the leader of the polis should be a philosopher. Otherwise, he becomes nothing more than a dictator. Within the Pythagorean communities, members were thoroughly equal. However, they had no freedom. The only guru was Pythagoras, who had absolute authority. Though a guru, Pythagoras was not a dictator, and he taught that what is commonly understood by freedom is not true freedom. True freedom involving overcoming the domination by the body and the sensible, that is, in privileging the spirit. The history of New Age communities all over the world obviously owes a great debt to Pythagoras. Hegel understood Pythagoras as a step on the way to Plato, and saw number as standing midway between sensuous things and thought, i.e., not yet the concept, but getting there. Number is only the beginning of thought, but it's not a very good beginning. This is normally how Pythagoras' number doctrine is understood, and Karatani gives more credit to Pythagorean number in the genesis and formation of Plato's theory of ideas. One need only look at the Timaeus carefully to realize Plato, like Pythagoras, sought the basis of idealism in mathematics. Famously hung a sign on the academy gates which reads, "Let no man ignorant of geometry enter here." Pythagoras bequeaths to Plato the idea that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, a notion that eventually makes the rounds until it winds up in Galileo. On Heraclitus, Karatani's view is no less interesting. He rejects the standard interpretation that Heraclitus was an aristocratic thinker who scorned the masses. We must remember that Heraclitus was raised when isonomia was only a distant memory. Political factions had long since taken over. What Heraclitus is really scorning is them. Yamakawa writes, Heraclitus, a man filled with pride and fierce character, passed his whole life in a turbulent age of lost freedom and humiliating servitude to the Persians. Rather than fighting against the Persians together with other poli, the Ephesian people accepted subjugation for the sake of survival. Heraclitus despised such people and hurled abuse at them. Is this reaction really best understood as anti-democratic and aristocratic, though? What Heraclitus speaks in the name of as aristos, or of most value and worth, is precisely Ionian isonomia, not subjection and servitude to the Persians or infighting among the factions. Fragment B44, the people of a city should fight for their laws as they would for their city walls, which Karatani reads as a statement of isonomial republicanism. On the topic of Heraclitus' praise of war or polemology, Karatani links it to the political situation. The Ephesians had sat out on the Ionian revolt and passed their days in tranquility in a state of dependence. Heraclitus despised such a peace because it meant resigning oneself to subordination. Thus, the surviving fragments are filled with words of praise for war and battle. One needs to keep in mind that these words were addressed to an Ephesus which, without a fight, had exchanged its independence for a state of security. On Heraclitus against Anaximander, Karatani notes that he rejects that strife leads to injustice. Rather, strife is what produces justice. Which is to say, if we avoid conflict and struggle, we bring about our own extinction. Heraclitus seems to have critiqued Pythagoras as a dilettante, an information gatherer, and a fraud. with no real philosophy of his own to show, but rather a cult. Heraclitus seems to have decisively rejected Pythagoras' two-world theory and to have maintained the natural philosophical position, emphasizing matter and its inherent motion. His logos Zeus Sophos being quite similar to Xenophanes' god. For Caratani, of course, it's true that Heraclitus placed great emphasis on change, multiplicity, and strife. Heraclitean becoming must be understood as unique in its context, and definitely not as a fight against being. The form of being which Heraclitus would indeed deny, however, is the Pythagorean, later Platonic. An eternal and incorruptible world is a fiction. The point is to discover the one in this world, not to project it into the illusions and fantasies of another. For Caratani, what is unique in Heraclitus is the total symmetry of the one and the many, wherein the one is generated from the totality of things, and the totality of things is generated from the one, a kind of Mobius strip in metaphysics. And lastly, like Heidegger, Caratani underlines, Heraclitus must not be read as an anti-political thinker, but rather as a proto-Socrates, who notes the value precisely of being apolitical for politics. Heraclitus never gave up his polis and continued to demand isonomia, despite all evidence to the contrary. He was an uncompromising individualist and cosmopolitan, yet remained in his polis. And this is because it is precisely in the polis that the logos must be realized. In this way, Heraclitus greatly resembles Socrates, who declined to flee Athens and remained even after receiving the death sentence. And even Plato recognizes this contribution being traceable to Heraclitus when he writes in the Republic, "Duty of a citizen lies in fidelity to the nomos of the polis, but this nomos is best realized through the direction of a superior individual." Okay, that's a wrap. I hope you've enjoyed your introductions to Xenophanes, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras. See you next week when we turn to the Eleatic thinkers.